Welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. We are your hosts, Dr. Scott Hoy, clinical psychologist,
and Kyle Miller, licensed counselor. Psychology Talk is a unique conversation about psychology around the globe. We speak with psychology experts to keep you informed about current issues and trends. We advocate toward reducing stigma and educate about mental health.
While you're listening, please take a moment to give us a review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, or your favorite streaming service. It helps us to continue providing you with quality programming. And now, enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jeremey Narby. Dr. Narby is a Canadian anthropologist and author. In his books, Dr. Narby examines shamanism, molecular biology, and shamans' knowledge of botanics and biology through the use of entheogens across many cultures. He grew up in Canada and Switzerland and studied history at the University of Kent in Canterbury and received his doctorate in anthropology from Stanford University. He works as the Amazonian Projects Director for the Swiss NGO Nouvelle Planète. He's the author of several books, including The Cosmic Serpent, DNA, and the Origins of Knowledge. Today, he will be discussing his new book, Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge, which he co-authored with Rafael Chanchari Pizuri, an elder of the Shawi people of Peru. Dr. Narby, a hearty welcome to the show.
Well, Scott, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. Well, certainly we kind of like to have the show open up. You could talk about yourself. You could talk about your book, which would be great, which I happen to have the pleasure of reading, or any topic you think would be important for you.
I'm happy to talk about what you mentioned, these plants to start with, tobacco and ayahuasca, and how indigenous Amazonian people understand them and how people in the Western world understand them, and the differences between those two systems of knowledge, one could say.
Absolutely. Well, you know what? What I was fascinated by was certainly the take on tobacco. As a former smoker who heartily enjoyed his tobacco habit for some years, I don't think Philip Morris had the same take on tobacco that indigenous people have. And certainly what I was imbibing was not, I guess, very much of what they were imbibing, which you go into in great detail, a very approachable look at the chemistry of tobacco and ayahuasca. But maybe you could kind of discuss that. What is tobacco really?
Well, this is where I'd rewind the tape of history, go back to the beginning of the story and start with the indigenous Amazonian perspective. Tobacco is a South American plant. There are different species of tobacco, but the tobacco that people smoke is usually Nicotiana tabacum or else Nicotiana rustica. And these are, frankly, South American, indeed Peruvian, foothill of the Andes, but still tropical Amazon. That seems to be where these plants originated in the wild. And that's where the people who ended up living there, perhaps 10,000 years ago, or who knows, domesticated these plants and then started using them. And they've been using them for a very long time. Tobacco, and this is something probably most people don't know. I mean, when you ask people about Amazonian shamanism, sometimes they don't even know what you're talking about. But those who do, they'll say, "Oh yes, ayahuasca." But in the Amazon, really, tobacco is the number one shamanic plant. And it's considered the number one medicinal plant. It's a painkiller. People apply the leaves to wounds to help calm the pain. Quite simply, people blow smoke on people who have fever to calm them, to soothe them. So tobacco is used by indigenous Amazonian people as a medicinal plant, and also as what they call a plant teacher, a powerful plant that teaches shamans different things. So what does this mean? We can already see there's a difference here. I'll briefly talk about. Eventually, white man ended up taking indigenous American tobacco because this tobacco ended up going north and reaching the indigenous people of the Americas. There was also native tobaccos in North America. So it's a long, complicated story. But in brief, the powerful dark shamanic tobaccos of the indigenous Americans was watered down by the folks on the East Coast. Virginia tobacco, blonde tobacco. It contains maybe 1% nicotine in its leaves compared to the dark tobacco that has like 20%.
Oh.
And so going back to the Amazon, when you smoke this dark shamanic tobacco, it is powerful, and it is probably appropriately classified as a hallucinogen.
Oh, okay.
People don't think of tobacco as a hallucinogen, but when you're dealing with this powerful dark stuff, you get into that territory. And the people that I lived with when I was a young anthropologist, the Ashaninka, they take tobacco in all kinds of ways, including as a kind of jam. They boil it down into a paste, and then they take little stick hits off of a stick. They stick a stick into the paste, mm-hmm. and then run it through their lips, and voila! And you can get a sort of a strong dose of this stuff. Kind of makes the whiskers on your chest grow. It makes your heart race. It has a deep impact on the body and on the mind. It's quite impressive. And so indigenous Amazonian shamans have been using this powerful plant for a long time, and they consider it to be one of the most important plant teachers.
Wow. Okay.
Well, so what is this plant teacher thing? I mean, most people in the Western world, if you say, "Oh yes, this plant taught me that," you can't even finish your sentence, and they think you're nuts. But in the Amazonian shamanic view, a plant teacher is what we might call a psychoactive plant, mm-hmm. a plant that has an impact on your mind, and so that when you ingest it, you see things, you think things that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. It's a psychoactive. It activates your neurons. And so then it takes you into a new way of thinking and of understanding. And they view that as a learning experience, and they consider the plant quite simply as a teacher in that sense. Mm-hmm. And tobacco is considered the number one plant teacher, if only because tobacco is widely recognized as a combo plant. It's a plant that you use with other teacher plants, and actually you'll find this. When people drink wine, they'll smoke tobacco. When people smoke hashish, they'll smoke tobacco too and mix it in. Tobacco lends itself to being consumed at the same time as other psychoactive plants. Mm-hmm. And so that's the case with ayahuasca as well. Almost all indigenous ayahuasqueros in the Amazon would not dream of taking ayahuasca without having tobacco on hand at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of the session. So that is also why tobacco is the number one shamanic plant, because it's used with all other powerful plants, and it's also used by itself. So among the Ashaninka people that I was living with, the word for shaman in their language was sheri piari. Sheri means tobacco. Piari is like the doctor, or the one who knows. So you go and see the tobacco doctor. You have a problem. You've got a fever. You can't shoot straight with your arrow, so your hunting is off. Any kind of preoccupation like this, you go and see the tobacco doctor. And the tobacco doctor will, first of all, smoke some tobacco and think about it. Tobacco also serves for posing a diagnostic. So this is how Amazonian people consider tobacco. And they use it with a lot of respect and also fear. I mean, it's quite clear to people that this is an ambiguous plant. It can also mislead you. There's a lot of people who get caught up in power games and what can be called sorcery with tobacco. I mean, it amplifies what's there. And if you're a power-hungry, aggressive person, it's not going to make you any less power-hungry and aggressive. So it's Amazonian people recognize that these plants, and in particular tobacco, are ambiguous, certainly dangerous. They're master plant in the sense that you never master them. They can master you, and that's what you gotta watch out that they don't do that. So why work with these powerful, dangerous plants if you can't master them and they can master you? Well, because you can get information from them and points of view that you couldn't otherwise. So you go up close to this powerful, dangerous being, you ingest it, but you do it prudently. You do it. You put a kind of a harness on the experience. You limit it in space and time. You don't do it all day long without thinking about it. If you're going to be starting to have a relationship with a plant like tobacco, you need to be aware of what you're doing. You're dealing with a very powerful entity that can kick your butt and mislead you. And so you want to do it, you want to be forewarned about it. And so there's a whole sort of, people don't do tobacco for pleasure. It's not, it's not for a habit. It's not for a pleasure. It's not that kind of thing. It's the kind of thing that you do deliberately at certain moments with a certain intention. And it's an intense experience.
It sounds like you really, as an anthropologist, you really became part of the experience phenomenologically. You were with the shamans. You talk about it in the book of like your own experiences with tobacco. Yeah, that's clearly the method. If you want to. I crossed the line a long time ago because it used to be that still in the 20th century, back in the 20th century, anthropology was busy trying to prove that it was a science. And so anthropologists were in this strange position where they'd go and hang out with these irrational people in the rainforest who would be saying all kinds of strange things, but they wanted to be as objective as possible. So it made it very difficult to have first-person hallucinogenic experience with the natives. And anthropologists who crossed that line quickly ran into trouble. I mean, Castaneda ran into trouble, but he also fictionalized somewhat, so that was also part of the problem. But a guy like Michael Harner ran into trouble, not because his work wasn't exact, but simply because he had crossed that line and started taking it a little bit too seriously. Stephen Lyons, are you familiar with Stephen Lyons, who's written a wonderful book called Spirit Talkers? He talks, he writes at great length about how, yes, indeed, people crossed that line, and there was they put the kibosh on doing that at some point. Yes, yeah, but he goes into great detail about the experience of stepping into a different Weltanschauung, or a different, sort of phenomenological experience, and it's just as valid as the Western paradigm, what we call the Western paradigm now.
Yeah, well, I spent, I'm still negotiating, going back and forth between those two worldviews. I'll just say that it's true that after spending a couple of years with Ashaninka people and trying the ayahuasca, trying the tobacco, seeing that there was something there that was not charted by the Western, paradigm, that there was something strong, powerful, full of information, but that escaped academic psychology, anthropology, and so forth. I actually hardly mentioned ayahuasca in my PhD dissertation about the rational uses of the rainforest by the Ashaninka people. It took me several more years working as an activist and fundraiser for indigenous Amazonian people to realize that not talking about the hallucinogenic origin of part of their knowledge was a misrepresentation, because I was going around raising funds in Europe in the early 1990s, saying that the best way to protect the rainforest was to entrust it to its indigenous inhabitants, who were the only ones to use it rationally, which was true. They were the only ones who used the rainforest productively without destroying it. But at the same time, I knew that I was not saying that they themselves say that at the heart of their knowledge about plants and animals in the rainforest are these plant teachers that teach them what they need to know. So I wrote a book called The Cosmic Serpent in the middle of the 1990s that deals with that tried to put that question on the table. And now it's become more acceptable, one could say. So ayahuasca has suddenly, it's on the table. It's been on the table for the last 20, 25 years or so. And people are recognizing that it has a very strong therapeutic potential and so on. There's been a whole explosion of scientific research on ayahuasca in the last 20 years. Yeah. One could say business is good for those who want to sort of go back and forth between indigenous Amazonian knowledge and scientific knowledge. Well, whereas 25 years ago, that was nowhere.
Yes. I think there's more of an acceptance of alternative perspectives from the kind of monolithic culture that we have enforced upon us. I mean, I think our minds have been colonized, in many ways. The animism that you discuss in the book and the ability with your co-author in the book to step back and forth between microbiology and Western scientific perspective, which I think was fascinating. You mentioned that he thinks in terms of science with Spanish, but then he uses his native tongue to think in terms of kind of an animistic perspective. I think one of the things I was going to ask you is we talked about what tobacco was. What is ayahuasca to you from your experience of indigenous populations and perspectives?
Sure. If I may, I just finished with tobacco because I was only halfway there, and then we started talking about crossing the line. So I'll just finish the tobacco, and I'll go straight into ayahuasca. Yeah. I sketched tobacco as it is in indigenous Amazonia, where it comes from, how it's been used there for thousands of years, and still is used there right now. Meanwhile, in Virginia, 300-400 years ago, European Americans, white Americans who arrived and colonized, cultivated the plant and weakened it. They didn't like the strong shamanic head spinning version, and so they selected blonde, weaker, and selected it down so that blonde tobacco has 1% nicotine. It's not really a powerful shamanic experience. And then in the 20th century, Western industrialized tobacco was turned into cigarettes. Cigarettes are nicotine delivery devices. This is how this industry talks about them. But delivery devices that are calibrated to deliver just enough nicotine to tickle the neurons, but never to actually fire them up. Like a motorcycle that goes bam, 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 and you never get the gear that sort of gets in. And so, and cigarettes are deliberately calibrated in this way so that you're motivated to fire up another one as soon as possible. In other words,
more dopamine.
You get the tickling effect, but then you don't get the delivery. And so, maybe I'll have another one. And meanwhile, this weakened form of this powerful plant is then all sauced up with hundreds of different chemicals that when you burn them, which is what happens when you smoke a cigarette, they turn into these dangerous carcinogenic substances. Mm-hmm. It should be said, nicotine is not the cause of cancer. Nicotine is not innocent. It can increase the risk of diabetes, for example. But to our knowledge, nicotine is not the cause of cancer. It's tars and it's the byproducts of these different chemicals that are added into the cigarettes. So what Western people have come to think of of tobacco, cigarettes, in other words, this is a watered down, adulterated form of a powerful plant that used to be a teacher plant in its original context, but when taken like this, teaches you nothing, and then all sauced up in dangerous chemicals. So then you think, well, wait a minute, how stupid can you be to take a powerful, dangerous plant and then weaken it so that it gives you none of the positive side of its power, and then turn it into, calibrate it so that it is addictive, so that you want to fire up another one every half hour, and lace it with dangerous chemicals. I mean, you couldn't do worse, really, with a powerful plant teacher. And clearly, turning it into this thing that people want to consume every half hour is part of the problem, not just because of the quantity of what you smoke, but also the regularity. I mean, if you're forever bombarding your lung cells with toxins, you're really increasing the risk of mutations happening because, healthy cells divide. And usually when a dividing cell gets bombarded by toxins, it stops the division and it aborts the operation. But if you're permanently and forever, every half hour, you're bombarding your lung cells with toxins, at some point there are going to be cells in there that will get caught right in the middle of their duplication, and their DNA will be exposed, and then there will be insults to the DNA, and those are mutations, and that's one of the ways in which cancer is caused. So, meanwhile, back in indigenous Amazonia, they're taking big doses of powerful tobacco, but only at certain moments, ritualized moments contained in space and time, one evening, 2 evenings a week, for 2 or 3 hours. And this is of a different order compared to permanently insulting your lung cells with the regular smoking of cigarettes. Mm-hmm. So industrial cigarettes, it's almost like 180 degrees apart from Amazonian tobacco. And that's interesting because what we have is 1.2 billion people in the world right now smoke cigarettes on a daily basis. And, if you take the Amazonian perspective, they don't know what they're doing. Because, in fact, it still is tobacco. I mean, even though it's been watered down and so forth. I mean, it's not another plant. It's not cannabis or opium or what have you. But So they're interacting with tobacco. Tobacco is part of their life, but they're getting nothing from tobacco. They're using it all the time, and they're poisoning themselves with it. This is exactly not how you work with tobacco from the Amazonian perspective.
It seems like the Amazonian use of tobacco is more like like you said, a psychedelic experience, and probably it's obviously not a dopaminergic kind of, get the person addicted to the substance experience. You probably do it in that ritualistic perspective. It has a cultural and ritualistic aspect to it that it's contained in, but also it probably isn't something you would want to do more than like
exactly,
all the time.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly right. You see, when you get a real nicotine delivery, it's not something that you want to repeat every half hour for the rest of your life.
Sort of like the experiment with cocaine versus psilocybin with rats, right? The rats will take they'll take the cocaine over and over and over and, until they die and not eat food, and they'll do the psilocybin once, or the other like LSD. I think it was psilocybin or LSD in the experiment, and then that's it. That was nice, and we're gonna press that button to get that again. We'll go eat some food and drink some water, have some sex, enjoy our life. Yeah.
Smart rats.
Yeah.
So meanwhile, ayahuasca, ayahuasca among people in the Western Amazon, because that's where the plant mainly grows. They've been using ayahuasca for centuries and perhaps longer than that, and it's perhaps the number 2 shamanic plant. I mean, it's not that Amazonian people are creating classifications like this, but it's true. Tobacco is the number 1, and ayahuasca comes right after it, and they kind of go together. I mean, there's a representation of the cosmos by the Shipibo people of the Peruvian Amazon that I reproduced in my book, The Cosmic Serpent. And so you see the earth, and you see the sort of cosmic dome and different shapes. And then they have 2 arrows that kind of cross each other like cardinal points, north, east, west, south, except at the tip of the 4 arrows, instead of the cardinal points, you have anaconda, jaguar, tobacco, and ayahuasca. And these are the 4, or the 2 axes, one could say, of their view of the world. The jaguar and the anaconda are top predators in the Amazonian ecosystem. In other words, these animals eat everything else, but they are not eaten themselves. Mm-hmm. And tobacco and ayahuasca are the 2 power plants of reference, and they go together. So it's true that people will talk about ayahuasca as just like they talk about tobacco, as a powerful entity. They say that each species has a kind of personality associated with it. They call owner or mother or father. They use those words interchangeably. So the mother of tobacco, the owner of ayahuasca. So what about these? So you want to know what they think about ayahuasca. They'll soon start telling you about the mother of ayahuasca. So what about the mother of ayahuasca? Well, like all these other powerful plants, in their view, these are powerful, ambiguous, dangerous, but also fascinating entities that can teach you many things, but also get you into trouble. They're tricky. It just seems, from an Amazonian perspective, that you'd even need to explain that they're tricky and dangerous it's not necessary, because it's just so obvious. They are when you start interacting regularly with these entities. That means what is the interacting with ayahuasca? It means ingesting it. That's how you interact with these psychoactive plants. You ingest them, and then you pay attention to how they impact on your body and on your mind. And that's the thing. I mean, we may think it's a little bit strange to think of plants having personalities, but with plants like tobacco and ayahuasca, once you've ingested them, you can at least study the impact that the plant has on your personality. So, you don't even have to believe that the plant has a personality. But all you have to do is pay attention to what happens to you when you ingest it. I can say on the basis of my personal experience that ayahuasca has a kind of a wise, somewhat trickstery personality or way of impacting on me. It often will show me things about myself that I'm usually not in a hurry to see. You see how stupid you are. You can suddenly you see a film of yourself in a situation, and you see yourself from above, and you see the mistakes that you made in certain situations. Just how this happens is mysterious. I'm an agnostic, scientifically trained kind of guy, and I'm in no hurry to actually believe anything. But these experiences are interesting. I mean, it's certainly when people take ayahuasca, including myself, they tend to have the experience of being in the presence of an independent intelligence. In other words, it's not just your own brain played back to you backwards or something. It actually does seem to have a wisdom of its own that's somehow independent from you. And I'm not saying outside of you, because actually it's clear that it's also inside of you at that point. When you ingest the plant, it's inside you. But it also seems to be giving you information that's coming from the outside. All this needs more research. And actually, that's also the mystery of consciousness, the mystery of how psychedelics actually work. This is far from resolved. But in any case, yes, ayahuasca is a powerful, natural hallucinogen. It's a vine, but it's also a mixture, so that can contain other plants. It's now recognized by science and by medical research as having a strong therapeutic potential for depression and also for people suffering from trauma and anxiety and perhaps even addictions. So there's been an explosion of research on ayahuasca in recent years. And perhaps what lags behind in that explosion of research is a true dialogue with indigenous Amazonian experts. And that's one of the things that we tried to put on the table with the book Plant Teachers, is that actually it's fairly easy for a Western fellow and for an Amazonian fellow to sit around a table and to exchange. And, so how do you think about this? Oh, well, I see it like this. And, oh, well, science, on the other hand, this is what it says. Oh, and that you can actually get a back and forth going that is productive for both sides, and it's fairly easy. All you need to do is sit down and start having a dialogue, just like you and I are doing today.
Well, are those dialogues actually happening, or are they happening as much as should be happening?
Well, I try not to use the word "should" that much, but. Because things happen as they happen. At their own rhythm. You can't sort of pull on the grass and make it grow faster. It'll just pull it out. But what seems pretty clear, it's interesting to look at what has happened in the last 5 or 10 years. The new science of ayahuasca, the kind of snags it runs into, besides not really being able to dialogue that easily with indigenous experts. I mean, here's a very concrete thing. The first thing that they want to do is put people in brain imagery machines. We want to know what's going on in their brain when they're under ayahuasca. Well, fair enough. But as you know, these fMRI machines are sort of not very enjoyable to stay in for long periods. And ayahuasca is a vomitive. I mean, it's a purge. That's what it's appreciated as such. They call it in the Peruvian Amazon. They call it la purga, the purge. Rather than the vine or whatever, it's the purge. And people like purging. They like cleaning out their digestive tract and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of stomach parasites down there, and that also makes sense. In any case, here is this brew that is considered medicinal because it's a purge. But when they started doing scientific research on it, they put vomiting under adverse effects. In fact, you can find these articles where they call... So they start to study it and do the brain imagery or different studies of ayahuasca in a lab. And invariably they'd say vomiting is the only adverse effect, in fact. So wait a second. This is considered to be probably its number one virtue by indigenous Amazonian people. And like an artifact, it's turned into an adverse effect. Also, not just because vomiting in a lab is sort of, you're not supposed to vomit in the lab. That's one thing. The other thing is that they're studying it as a psychedelic. Well, it may be a psychedelic in the sense that it reveals the psyche, but it's also about the body. I mean, indigenous people never said this affects your psyche. They don't even have the concept of psyche. They don't oppose body and mind. They think of person. Or perhaps, like Ashaninka people, they'll talk about skin and they'll talk about heart. So there's outside and inside, but they don't have body and mind. So when you take ayahuasca, I mean, obviously it goes into your stomach and it makes you vomit, but then it also shows you images. But before being a psychedelic, where you see images and so forth, it's an intensely body-based experience. But this gets obscured by scientists who consider ayahuasca as a psychedelic, and who then go on to view vomiting as an adverse effect. So this is the kind of distortion that, I'm not, trashing scientists here. It's just like they have goodwill. They just want to study ayahuasca as you would normally study anything. But the problem is that ayahuasca doesn't let itself be taken into the lab that easily. It's like a wild horse or something. It's hard to study it in a lab. And so for the moment, there have been, I'll just give you one last example. Ayahuasca is conceived as a cocktail. In other words, the vine itself already contains several alkaloids that are psychoactive. And then people mix other plants into an ayahuasca vine tea to understand other plants. So there is no standard ayahuasca. It can contain coca leaves or tobacco or datura or Psychotria viridis chacruna DMT containing. It can contain different psychoactive molecules and not just the ones that are in the vine. There is no standard ayahuasca. That's the whole point. Along comes science, and scientists, they want to have standardized. They want something. They can't study it if it's not standardized. So then they've created this kind of fiction. All right, so they even say, yes, we used a batch of standardized ayahuasca. They've defined that standardized ayahuasca is a mix of the vine with DMT-containing Psychotria viridis. They've said the main ingredient, which is also another scientific obsession, is DMT. But this is a big distortion. Some ayahuascas do not contain DMT. All ayahuascas contain harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, which are psychoactive substances in their own right, but that have been understudied because of this DMT emphasis. And so this is just another example where scientists with the best intentions have started to study ayahuasca, but simply by studying it as they usually would in a scientific way, they've immediately brought distortions to it.
Well, obviously, it takes the plant out of the context of it being a plant in an environment and a whole lot of other things. It doesn't interact with the plant on its terms, or the mixture. Probably it's different for each culture. Right? Each tribe has a different way of working with it. The elders have different ways of working with it as a plant teacher, I assume. Yeah.
That's it. So, but all that, these are like the growing pains of a young science. Mm-hmm. What's going on? The scientific interest in ayahuasca is thrilling, and I hope it will continue. And these are growing pains that need to be worked out. And I do think that leading the research hand in hand with indigenous specialists would be a way of moving forward faster and better, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to see what's going on with all the psychedelic and the kind of pseudo-psychedelic research that, like MDMA and ketamine and other things. But we shall see what happens with it as it plays out. Will it still be effective? Will it be some kind of regression to the mean with these new, the effectiveness or whatever?
They've got remarkable results on depression down in Brazil with ayahuasca, where a single dose sends people with chronic depression into remission for 8 months.
Wow.
So, that's compared to the other medicines, antidepressants on the market. I mean, there's just like no competition.
Absolutely. No, I agree with that. Yeah, but we'll see how they play out in regards to like a Western context or, a lab context versus how they play out indigenously. Maybe it's different. Maybe there's some element.
It may well be that we'll need a new way of doing science to understand ayahuasca. We're going to have to go outside of the lab and do it differently.
Well, that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. So,
look, I've got to run.
I know you do, but I thank you so much for your time. This is fascinating. I could sit and listen and chat with you for another couple of hours, Dr. Narby. And I thank you for your time, and I thank you for your book, Plant Teachers, which is available from New World libraries everywhere.
Well, Scott, it's a pleasure talking with you, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Always welcome back.
Okay.
And take care.
Ciao.
Thanks for listening to the Psychology Talk podcast. Did you know that the Psychology Talk podcast has a Facebook page and an Instagram page? It's true. You can find more information about other guests and episodes, as well as more information about psychology and mental health. And if you liked this episode, go ahead and like us on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Stitcher, or Spotify and leave a review. It helps us grow our audience and provide more quality shows. All material, copyright the Psychology Talk podcast. This podcast is for informative and entertainment purposes only. If you need a mental health professional, please seek one out. Music is provided by the band Serenati.